Well, this is always an exciting time of the budget. This is going to be a very big budget, I guess, because this is the last major budget, in fact, the last full budget before the general election. So everyone's going to be keeping their eyes on Nirmala Sitharaman. Now, we are here at what seems to have become an annual ritual. CII gathers all the top industrialists into this giant complex, and everyone sits together and listens to the budget and then, makes their own comments and decides what's happening. We're going to be taking you through the budget speech. We're going to get a lot of experts to come here and sit and talk to about what they're expecting, and after the budget, whether they're happy or whether they're disappointed. But let's just start off by getting a sense of how important this budget is, how the economy is doing, and what else can happen. Gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. DK Joshi, the chief economist of CRISIL, somebody watching the economy very closely. Mr. Joshi, let me just first get your sense. How's the economy doing, and how important is this budget going to be?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the economy is experiencing broad-based recovery right now. And though inflation continues to be a problem, it's not settled as yet. And so there is the survey yesterday also was pointing towards some sort of cautious optimism on the inflation front. Then I think the major risk right now is from the global side. The advanced countries are expected to slow down very sharply, and that's going to reflect on our exports and via exports on the sectors that service the export demand. So there is a downside risk from there. And the other, I think, risk from the external environment is that when you run a high current account deficit, the financing of that becomes an issue when the global financial conditions are tight, and which they are right now because the central banks in advanced countries are raising rates. So that, I think, so these are some of the worries. But I think overall, India continues to do better than most economies of its size right now. So how the domestic demand will hold up in the face of these external risks that's what will have to be seen. I mean, and I also want to point out that the assumptions that the budget makes on the growth, etc. I think last year's budget kind of highlighted that those assumptions may not hold in such a uncertain environment. So you need to have a very nimble approach and recalibrate your assessment of various aspects of the budget throughout the year. So that's one. And then second, I think, issue that I want to highlight is that the budget doesn't have too much leeway. I mean, the ability for higher discretionary spending is very low because you have to maintain fiscal deficit on a declining trajectory as a percentage of GDP. So and your committed expenditure is very large part. I think almost 90% of the tax revenues are eaten up by committed expenditure. So the flexibility is very low. So when you don't want to borrow too much, you don't have much discretionary spending, then it becomes really a very tough balancing act. I think every budget is a tough balancing act, but this one is going to test the dexterity of the policymaker much more.
All right, let me just try and get some specific proposals out of you. I know we are past the era where we're really hoping for a lot of indirect taxes to be changed. In fact, people say there should be continuity. There are expectations for changes in personal taxation, at least this time around, and also maybe some signals around reforms, the paths that are going to be taken forward. What are some of the things you would like to hear in this budget?
Well, I think so there is enough evidence that the lower income brackets have faced higher inflation, and the disparity between rich and lower income categories have risen. So and there is need to support the particularly the lower middle class. So I think in this milieu it becomes important to adjust the tax rates because or standard deduction, etc. The reason for that is because they have not been touched for quite some time, and because of high inflation, their value has reduced. So you're not getting that much exemption in real terms that you used to get a couple of years back. So I think there is some need to do that. So there could be some rationalization on that part. The big reform on tax would be get rid of exemptions and make it straightforward. I think that will have to wait. Then other is, I think the government how the government tries to support the vulnerable sections. One is through the food subsidy, et cetera. Then second is whether they push for more construction activities which are labor intensive and so on. So I think these kind of strategies, what I would be looking for, I mean, what the budget does on these. And I think overall then there is also need to push capital spending. So now you have to grow the size of the pie, and that can only be done by increasing, making growth faster, and then you have to redistribute it also. So I think both these elements, I think I'll be watching out, and I would also be looking for whether the budget doesn't lose sight of the medium term, which I think the economic survey pointed out yesterday, that you need more reforms to raise the growth potential over the medium run. So it expects India to grow at around 6.5%. If you want to grow faster over the medium run, then you need to do more.
Right. So, quite often it is said, worry about the fiscal deficit, don't spend too much because it could affect private investment. Now, the economic survey and recent theory seems to be saying, spend on things like infrastructure. Don't worry about the fiscal deficit that much. Spend on things like infrastructure because it could crowd in private investment. So is that something you think we're going to see a lot of? Massive spending on infrastructure and on capital expenditure?
Well, they will keep their focus on infrastructure spending, particularly in the roads, railways, et cetera, which they have been doing in the last 2 years. But I don't think there is space for a massive fiscal spending by increasing the fiscal deficit. So they have to reduce the fiscal deficit because they've committed to a glide path to cut the fiscal deficit down to 4.5% of GDP by 25-26. And that's a pretty stiff target. To be on that target, they also have to reduce the deficit this year as well. I think there are some other positive sides of cutting the deficit. I think it makes RBI's life easy because the central bank is trying to control demand a little bit so that it can control core inflation. I think even the survey also pointed out that lower fiscal deficit means lower borrowing costs, I think, in the system. So I think there are, so you need to balance both these objectives. I think, as I pointed out earlier, there's not, it's not 0-1 option. I mean, there is, I think, there's need to balance both the objectives of pushing capex and also reducing the deficit. That can only be done by restructuring spending. So they will have to cut some spending on revenue spending and find out ways for more efficient spending.